Don't let anyone see his face tonight. Ethan Whitmore heard his mother's voice through the cracked ballroom door, cold and sharp enough to cut through the music drifting down the marble hallway. If the king notices that boy, this family will become a laughingstock. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately, fingers tightening around the silver tray he carried against his chest. The polished metal trembled slightly in his hands, reflecting the faint outline of his face beneath the dim corridor lights. He hated reflections. Reflections reminded him why the servants whispered when he passed by and why noble guests suddenly looked away whenever his hood slipped too low. Somewhere inside the grand ballroom, violins played softly while laughter echoed beneath glittering chandeliers. Tonight was Caleb's 19th birthday celebration, and the Whitmore estate had transformed into a palace of gold and crystal for the occasion. Hundreds of candles illuminated the towering ceilings. Noble families from across the kingdom had arrived in silk and diamonds. Even members of the royal court were rumored to be attending. But Ethan was forbidden from stepping inside. Stay hidden until the guests leave, Lady Margaret had ordered earlier that evening while adjusting Caleb's emerald green collar with gentle hands she had never once used on Ethan. You already embarrass me enough simply by being born. Caleb had remained silent beside her, beautiful and flawless beneath the morning sunlight pouring through the breakfast hall windows. His golden hair shimmered like polished honey. His skin looked untouched by hardship. Everything about him reflected perfection. Ethan, meanwhile, stood several feet away wearing servant gray. His silver-ash hair barely covered the pale scar stretching across his left cheek. Yes, mother, Ethan had whispered softly. He always answered softly now. Years ago, he used to ask questions. He used to wonder why his mother never hugged him, why he was forced to eat alone, why servants avoided meeting his eyes. But questions only led to punishment. Silence was safer. So now he obeyed. Even tonight. Especially tonight. Ethan adjusted the tray again and stepped deeper into the corridor's shadows as another burst of laughter erupted from inside the ballroom. Through the narrow opening in the door, he caught glimpses of glittering gowns and noblemen in dark formal coats, moving across the dance floor. Caleb stood at the center of it all, radiant beneath the chandeliers while guests praised his beauty openly. The Whitmores are blessed with such a perfect omega. He'll surely catch the king's attention. Look at his posture. His grace. Absolutely stunning. Ethan lowered his head further at every compliment spoken about his brother. Not because he hated Caleb. He didn't. That almost made everything worse. Caleb had never truly been cruel to him. Distant, yes. Embarrassed, certainly. But never openly vicious like their mother. Caleb simply existed in a different world. A warm world. A world Ethan had only ever watched from behind closed doors. Suddenly, the music inside the ballroom shifted. Conversation softened. The atmosphere itself seemed to change. Ethan frowned slightly as heavy footsteps echoed across the marble entrance hall downstairs. Then came the voice of the royal announcer. His Majesty, King Adrian Blackwell. The entire ballroom fell silent. Even from the hallway, Ethan could feel it. The tension. The reverence. The fear. King Adrian Blackwell rarely attended noble gatherings unless absolutely necessary. Stories about the Alpha King traveled through every corner of the kingdom like whispered storms. Some claimed he could silence an entire room with a single glance. Others said rival nobles trembled merely standing near him. Ethan had only seen sketches of the king before now, cold portraits hanging in government buildings and newspapers. Dark hair. Sharp eyes. An expression carved from ice itself. Stand straight, Lady Margaret hissed inside the ballroom. Smile, Caleb. Ethan took an instinctive step backward into deeper shadow. He should leave before someone noticed him lingering nearby. But before he could move, a strange warmth brushed across the scar on his cheek. Ethan froze instantly. Pain flickered beneath his skin. Soft at first. Then sharper. He sucked in a quiet breath and lifted trembling fingers toward the scar hidden beneath his hair. Warm. Why was it warm? Confused, Ethan glanced toward the ballroom entrance again. That was when he saw him, King Adrian stood near the center of the grand hall surrounded by nobles who suddenly looked painfully small beside him. He wore black formal military attire embroidered with silver thread, the high collar emphasizing the sharp line of his jaw. His presence consumed the room completely. Calm. Silent. Dangerous. Every noble bowed their heads respectfully as the king's golden eyes swept across the ballroom with detached indifference. Then his gaze stopped. Ethan's breath caught painfully in his throat. The king was looking directly toward the hallway. Toward him. For one impossible moment, the noise disappeared completely. Ethan forgot the tray in his hands. Forgot the scar on his face. Forgot how to breathe. The king's eyes narrowed slightly, not with disgust like everyone else's usually did, but with something Ethan couldn't understand. Recognition. Confusion. Interest. Behind Ethan, Lady Margaret suddenly noticed where the king was looking. Her face drained of color instantly. "Ethan!" she snapped in a vicious whisper. "Get out of sight now!" Ethan flinched immediately, lowering his eyes as panic flooded his chest. He turned too quickly, the silver tray slipping from his trembling fingers before crashing against the marble floor with a sharp metallic sound that echoed through the silent ballroom. Every head turned. Ethan's heartbeat stopped. Lady Margaret looked horrified. Caleb stared at him in shock. The servants nearby froze completely. And across the ballroom, beneath the crystal chandeliers and hundreds of watching eyes, King Adrian Blackwell continued staring directly at Ethan Whitmore like he had just discovered something the rest of the kingdom had failed to see. The sound of the fallen tray still echoed through the ballroom long after the servants rushed to clean the scattered silver from the marble floor. Ethan stood frozen beneath the weight of hundreds of eyes, his pulse hammering so hard against his ribs that he could barely hear the orchestra resume playing again. He kept his head lowered, staring at the shattered reflection of himself in the polished silver near his shoes. Around him, whispers spread quickly through the ballroom like smoke. "That is the older Whitmore's son? I thought they kept him hidden. Poor thing. No wonder the family never speaks about him." Ethan's fingers curled tightly against the fabric of his sleeves. He wished the marble floor would open beneath him and swallow him whole. Lady Margaret crossed the ballroom with perfect posture despite the fury burning in her eyes. The moment she reached Ethan, her hand gripped his wrist hard enough to make him flinch. "Smile," she whispered through clenched teeth while maintaining a graceful expression for the watching guests. "If you embarrass me further tonight, I promise you will regret it." Ethan nodded immediately. "Yes, mother." Her nails tightened slightly against his skin before she released him. "Go upstairs. Now." Ethan obeyed without another word. He moved quickly through the ballroom while nobles subtly stepped aside to avoid brushing against him. Some stared openly at the pale scar stretching beneath his silver hair. Others simply looked relieved when he passed. Ethan kept his eyes fixed on the staircase ahead until a deep voice suddenly stopped him. "Lord Whitmore." The entire ballroom fell silent again. Ethan's breath caught painfully as he turned slowly toward the center of the room. King Adrian Blackwell stood only a few feet away now, his golden eyes fixed directly on Ethan with calm intensity. Up close, the king felt even more terrifying somehow. Not loud. Not cruel. Just absolute. Like winter itself had taken human form. Ethan lowered his gaze instantly. "Your Majesty. Look at me." The command was quiet, but impossible to ignore. Ethan hesitated before slowly lifting his eyes again. The ballroom around them faded into silence. Adrian studied Ethan carefully, his expression unreadable. Not disgusted. Not pitying. Merely focused. Ethan felt strangely exposed beneath that stare, as though the king could see every secret he had spent years trying to hide. The warmth beneath Ethan's scar returned suddenly, sharper this time. He nearly winced. Adrian noticed. Immediately. His gaze shifted briefly toward Ethan's cheek before narrowing almost imperceptibly. "How old are you?" the king asked. Ethan blinked softly, startled by the question. 19, Your Majesty. And yet you were hidden from court." Lady Margaret stepped forward quickly before Ethan could say another word. My son has always been rather shy, she said smoothly. He prefers solitude. Adrian did not look at her. I did not ask you. The temperature in the ballroom seemed to drop instantly. Lady Margaret's smile faltered for only a second before returning carefully. Of course, Your Majesty. Ethan lowered his eyes again, confusion twisting painfully in his chest. Why was the king speaking to him at all? He could feel the attention of every noble in the room pressing against his skin. Caleb stood several feet away now, visibly nervous beneath the chandeliers. Even he looked confused by the king's interest. Adrian remained silent for a long moment before finally speaking again. You seem unwell. Ethan instinctively touched the side of his face where the scar burned beneath his skin. I am fine, Your Majesty. You are trembling. Ethan quickly lowered his hand again. He had not even realized it himself. The warmth beneath the scar kept pulsing strangely, almost responding to the king's presence. It frightened him. Nothing about tonight felt normal anymore. Adrian's eyes lingered on Ethan another moment before he finally stepped back slightly. Interesting, he murmured quietly, almost to himself. Then, without another word, the king turned away and resumed speaking with nearby nobles as though nothing unusual had happened at all. The music slowly returned. Conversations cautiously resumed. But the atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed completely. Ethan could feel it immediately. Every gaze now followed him with renewed curiosity. Not because he was ugly. Not because he was hidden. But because the king had looked at him. Lady Margaret's expression hardened dangerously. Go to your room, she whispered coldly without facing him. Do not come downstairs again tonight. Ethan nodded quickly and escaped the ballroom before his shaking legs gave out. Beneath him. The moment he reached the quiet upper hallways of the estate, he pressed himself against the wall and inhaled sharply. His heart still raced uncontrollably. Why had the king looked at him like that? Ethan moved toward his bedroom slowly, candlelight flickering across the long empty corridors of the Whitmore estate. Outside the tall windows, snow drifted softly across the dark gardens below. Winter storms had covered most of the kingdom for weeks now, turning the world pale and silent beneath ice. Ethan reached his room at the far end of the servant wing, and quietly closed the door behind him. The small room felt colder than usual tonight. He crossed toward the cracked mirror above his dresser and slowly brushed silver hair away from his cheek. The scar beneath his eye shimmered faintly under the candlelight. Ethan stared at it in horror. That had never happened before. He touched it carefully with trembling fingertips. Warm. Almost alive. A sudden knock sounded at his door. Ethan jumped violently before quickly pulling his hair back over the scar. Come in, he whispered. The door opened slowly. Caleb stood there alone, still dressed in elegant emerald silk from the party downstairs. For a moment neither brother spoke. Then Caleb quietly closed the door behind him. Why did the king stare at you like that? He asked softly. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. I do not know. Caleb studied him carefully, uncertainty clouding his normally calm expression. Mother is furious. Ethan managed a weak smile that did not reach his eyes. She usually is. Caleb looked away briefly before speaking again in a quieter voice. You should be careful tonight, Ethan. A chill ran down Ethan's spine instantly. What do you mean? Caleb hesitated. I heard Mother speaking with the house steward after the ballroom incident. He swallowed once. She said you have become a problem. Ethan's stomach tightened painfully. Outside the window, snow continued falling silently across the dark kingdom while somewhere far below, King Adrian Blackwell remained inside the Whitmore ballroom, still thinking about the hidden Omega with silver hair and the strange scar that burned. Beneath winter candlelight. The storm arrived just before midnight. Snow hammered against the tall windows of the Whitmore estate, while icy wind rattled the ancient glass hard enough to wake Ethan from his shallow sleep. For a few confused seconds he stared at the dark ceiling above his small bedroom, trying to remember why his chest still felt tight. Then he remembered the ballroom. The king's eyes. Caleb's warning. You have become a problem. Ethan slowly sat up beneath the thin blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The fire in his room had burned out hours ago, leaving only bitter cold behind. He crossed quietly toward the frosted window and looked down at the estate gardens buried beneath heavy snow. Most of the mansion had gone dark now except for faint candlelight glowing from the lower west wing where Lady Margaret usually handled private affairs late into the night. Ethan should not have cared anymore. He knew better than to wonder what his mother planned. Nothing good had ever come from being noticed by Lady Margaret Whitmore. Still, unease twisted painfully inside him. Ever since the king looked at him downstairs, the atmosphere inside the estate had shifted. Servants suddenly avoided him more than usual. Guards whispered when he passed. Even Caleb looked frightened earlier. Ethan touched the side of his face unconsciously. The scar no longer glowed, but faint warmth still lingered beneath his skin like dying embers beneath ash. He hated it. Hated whatever strange thing was happening to him. A sudden knock echoed softly against his bedroom door. Ethan froze immediately. No servant ever visited his room this late at night. "Come in," he whispered cautiously. The door opened slowly. One of the older household maids stepped inside carrying a folded cloak. Mrs. Harper rarely spoke directly to Ethan, but tonight her face looked pale beneath the candlelight. "Your mother requests your presence downstairs," she said quietly. Ethan's stomach tightened instantly. "Now?" The older woman nodded once. "Bring the cloak. It is cold outside." "Outside?" Ethan stared at her in confusion. "Outside?" Mrs. Harper avoided his eyes. "Please do not make this difficult, Master." Fear crawled slowly down Ethan's spine. He took the cloak with trembling hands and followed the maid through the dark servant corridors in silence. The mansion felt strangely empty tonight. Most guests had already left after the royal visit ended hours ago. Snowstorm winds howled faintly through distant hallways while candle flames flickered weakly against stone walls. Ethan pulled the heavy cloak tighter around himself as they descended toward the lower entrance hall. Lady Margaret stood waiting near the estate carriage doors beside two guards dressed for winter travel. Caleb was nowhere in sight. The moment Ethan entered the hall, his mother's eyes settled on him with cold disappointment. "You took too long." Ethan lowered his head immediately. "I apologize, Mother." Lady Margaret stepped closer, studying him beneath the dim lantern light. "Do you understand what you did tonight?" Ethan swallowed nervously. "I dropped a tray. You drew the king's attention." Her voice sharpened instantly. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" Ethan blinked in confusion. "Dangerous? I did not mean to upset anyone. That is the problem." She snapped softly. "You never mean to do anything, yet disaster follows you everywhere." Ethan flinched automatically. Lady Margaret inhaled slowly before regaining her calm expression again. "The royal court has spent months preparing introductions for Caleb. Tonight was important for our family." Her eyes hardened. "Then you appeared." Ethan's fingers tightened against the cloak. "I am sorry." "Sorry does not erase what happened." She looked toward the storm beyond the carriage doors. "Fortunately, I have already arranged a solution." A terrible feeling settled inside Ethan's chest. "Solution?" One of the guards opened the carriage door silently. Snow and freezing wind immediately swept into the entrance hall. Lady Margaret finally looked directly into Ethan's eyes. "You will be leaving the estate tonight." Ethan stared at her in stunned silence. "Leaving?" "There is a monastery near the northern border," she continued coldly. "Remote. Quiet. Appropriate for someone like you." Ethan's heartbeat stumbled painfully. Northern border. Everyone knew how brutal winters became beyond the Frostmere forests. Roads vanished beneath snow for weeks. Entire villages disappeared during storms. "Mother!" His voice cracked slightly. "I do not understand. You were never meant for court life." Lady Margaret interrupted smoothly. "This is kinder for everyone." "Kinder." Ethan almost laughed at the word. Instead, he lowered his eyes again because years of survival had taught him one painful truth. Nothing he said would matter. Will Caleb know? He asked softly. For the first time, something almost unreadable crossed Lady Margaret's face. Irritation. Guilt. Maybe either. Caleb understands his duty to this family. Ethan nodded slowly despite the ache spreading through his chest. Of course he did. Everyone in this family understood their duty except Ethan. He had always been the flaw hidden behind locked doors. The embarrassment. The mistake. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly through the snowstorm sky. Ethan looked toward the open carriage again. Fear pressed heavily against his lungs now. Something about this felt wrong. Not exile. Finality. How long will I stay there? He whispered quietly. Lady Margaret adjusted her gloves without answering immediately. Then she finally said, As long as necessary. The guard stepped closer. Ethan stared at his mother one last time, silently begging for some trace of warmth in her expression. Some sign that she might stop this. Instead, she only looked tired. You should be grateful, she said softly. Most noble families would have abandoned an Omega like you years ago. The words settled over Ethan like fresh snow burying something already dying beneath winter ground. He lowered his head one final time. Yes, Mother. Without another word, Ethan climbed into the carriage. The heavy door closed behind him with a hollow sound that echoed strangely through the storm. Moments later the horses began moving across the frozen estate roads while snow swallowed the Whitmore mansion behind him inch by inch. Ethan sat silently inside the dark carriage, clutching his cloak tightly around himself, as icy wind rattled the windows beside him. Somewhere far away beyond the mountains and forests of the Northern Kingdom, King Adrian Blackwell had likely already returned to the royal palace by now. But back at the Whitmore estate, hidden safely behind candlelit walls, Lady Margaret Whitmore stood perfectly still beneath the falling snow while watching the carriage disappear into the darkness with the expression of someone trying very hard not to remember what she had just done. By dawn, the storm had swallowed the roads completely. Ethan had lost all sense of direction hours ago. The carriage wheels groaned against thick snow while freezing wind screamed through the forests surrounding them. Inside the carriage, Ethan sat curled beneath the heavy cloak, shivering despite the layers wrapped tightly around his thin frame. His fingertips had gone numb sometime during the night. Every breath fogged faintly in the freezing air. The small lantern hanging inside the carriage flickered weakly with each violent jolt over the icy road. Ethan stared blankly at the dim light, while exhaustion slowly dragged at his thoughts. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lady Margaret standing beneath the estate lanterns watching him leave without hesitation. As though she had finally removed something unpleasant from her life. Ethan pressed trembling fingers against the scar beneath his hair again. The strange warmth had returned during the night. Not painful exactly. Just restless. Like something beneath his skin was trying to wake up. Outside, one of the guards cursed loudly as the horses slowed again. Road is buried, another voice shouted through the storm. We should stop until morning. Orders were clear, the first guard replied sharply. We keep moving north. Ethan frowned slightly at that. North. Farther north than expected. He had overheard servants speak about the border monasteries before. None of them were this deep into Frostmere territory. Unease settled heavily into his stomach again. He slowly pushed the frozen curtain beside the carriage window aside. Snow covered everything beyond sight. Endless white forests. Black trees twisted beneath ice. No villages. No lights. No signs of civilization at all. Fear tightened painfully in his chest. Excuse me, Ethan called softly toward the front of the carriage. No answer came. Excuse me? The carriage suddenly stopped hard enough to throw Ethan forward against the seat. Outside, the horses whined nervously while the guards argued through the storm. Ethan could barely hear them over the wind. Then the carriage door swung open violently. Freezing air rushed inside instantly. Out! One guard ordered coldly. Ethan blinked in confusion. What? We cannot continue with the carriage. Snow whipped violently around the armored men standing outside. One pointed toward a narrow path disappearing deeper into the white forest. The monastery is further ahead. Ethan looked at the storm in disbelief. On foot? Move. Ethan hesitated before slowly stepping out into the snow. The cold hit him instantly like knives against his skin. Wind tore through his cloak while thick snow reached nearly to his knees. His boots sank heavily into the frozen ground with every step. How much farther? He asked quietly. Neither guard answered. One climbed back onto the driver's seat, while the other shut the carriage door again. Ethan stared at them in confusion as the horses shifted restlessly in place. Wait, he said softly. I thought you were taking me there. The older guard avoided his eyes. Orders changed. Ethan's heartbeat slowed painfully. Changed? The man looked away toward the storm. Keep walking north. But I do not know where. You will figure it out. Fear spread coldly through Ethan's chest. Please! His voice cracked slightly. I cannot walk alone in this weather. The younger guard finally looked at him then, and something almost guilty flickered across his face before disappearing again. We are sorry, young master. Ethan's blood turned cold. Sorry. Not monastery. Not exile. Understanding hit him all at once with terrifying clarity. Lady Margaret never intended for him to survive the journey. The carriage wheels shifted suddenly as the driver pulled the horses around. Panic flooded Ethan instantly. Wait! He stumbled forward through the snow. Please wait! Wind swallowed his voice almost immediately. The carriage began moving. Away! Please! Ethan chased after it desperately for several feet, snow dragging painfully at his legs. Mother said. His words disappeared into the storm. The carriage never slowed. Ethan stopped moving at last, chest heaving violently while snow whipped against his face hard enough to sting. The lanterns attached to the carriage faded smaller and smaller between the trees until finally they vanished completely into white darkness. Silence followed. Terrible silence. Ethan stood alone in the middle of the frozen forest, while snow buried his footprints, almost immediately behind him. For several long seconds, he could not breathe properly. His mind refused to accept what had just happened. Lady Margaret had not sent him away. She had abandoned him. A weak sound escaped his throat before he quickly covered his mouth with shaking hands. No. No crying. Crying changed nothing. It never had. Ethan forced himself to inhale slowly despite the sharp pain spreading through his chest. Think. He needed shelter. Warmth. Something. He pulled the cloak tighter around himself, and turned toward the endless white forest ahead. Snow fell so heavily now he could barely see more than 20 feet in front of him. Every direction looked identical beneath the storm. Ethan walked anyway. One step. Then another. His legs trembled violently after less than 10 minutes. Cold soaked through his boots. Wind clawed at his hair and face mercilessly. Time blurred strangely inside the storm. Minutes became hours. Ethan no longer knew how far he had walked when dizziness finally began creeping through his body. His breathing turned uneven. The warmth beneath his scarf burned hotter now, spreading faint heat across his skin in strange waves that only made him feel more disoriented. Help! He whispered weakly once, though nobody existed to hear him. The Frostmere forest stretched endlessly around him like a frozen graveyard. Ethan stumbled suddenly, collapsing to one knee in the snow. Pain shot through his frozen fingers as they struck ice beneath the surface. He tried forcing himself back upright, but his body barely responded anymore. Too cold. Everything hurt. The world around him blurred. Faintly beneath falling snow. Ethan looked upward weakly toward the white sky while exhaustion dragged heavily at his eyelids. Maybe this was easier. Maybe disappearing quietly into snow was better than returning to a world where nobody wanted him. His mother certainly did not. Even Caleb had not stopped this. Ethan lowered his head slowly, silver hair falling across his face as snow gathered across his shoulders. The warmth beneath his scar pulsed harder suddenly. Once. Twice. Then somewhere beyond the trees, Faint and distant beneath the howl of the storm, came the sound of approaching horses. The sound of horses grew louder through the storm, distant at first, then terrifyingly close. Ethan forced his heavy eyelids open again as snow continued collecting across his shoulders and hair. His body barely responded anymore. Every breath hurt. The frozen forest around him blurred into pale shadows beneath the violent snowfall. Somewhere nearby, men shouted over the wind. "Tracks end here. The storm is getting worse. Your Majesty, we should turn back before nightfall." Ethan barely understood the voices. His thoughts drifted strangely now, slow and numb from cold. He tried lifting his head but failed. The warmth beneath the scar on his cheek pulsed again, stronger than before. Then silence fell. Not complete silence. The storm still roared through the trees. But the voices stopped abruptly, as though something unexpected had captured everyone's attention at once. Heavy footsteps crunched through the snow toward him. Ethan managed to lift his eyes slightly. A tall figure emerged through the white storm like something carved from winter itself. Black coat. Broad shoulders dusted with snow. Golden eyes sharp beneath dark hair whipped by the wind. King Adrian Blackwell. Ethan's breath caught weakly in his throat. For one impossible moment, he thought he might already be dying. The king stopped only a few feet away, staring down at him with unreadable intensity. Snow swirled violently around them both while royal guards remained farther back among the trees, visibly tense. Adrian said nothing at first. His gaze moved slowly across Ethan's trembling form, lingering briefly on the frost covering his lashes before finally settling on the hidden scar beneath silver hair. Ethan tried to speak, but only a weak breath escaped him. The king crouched slightly in the snow without taking his eyes off Ethan. "Why are you here alone?" His voice remained calm despite the storm. Ethan swallowed painfully. I was sent away." Adrian's expression did not change. "By who?" Ethan hesitated instinctively. Even now, fear of dishonoring his family remained buried deep inside him. "My family." Wind howled through the trees again. One of the royal guards approached cautiously from behind. "Your Majesty," the man said quietly, "we should continue moving. Visibility is worsening." Adrian ignored him completely. Instead, he reached toward Ethan slowly, brushing snow away from the silver hair partially covering his cheek. The moment his gloved fingers neared the scar, warmth exploded beneath Ethan's skin. Ethan gasped sharply in surprise. Adrian froze instantly. Beneath the falling snow, faint silver light shimmered briefly beneath the scar before fading again. The king's golden eyes narrowed. Behind him, the guards exchanged startled looks. "Did you see that?" one whispered under his breath. Adrian remained perfectly still for several seconds, staring at Ethan with dangerous focus now. Not curiosity anymore. Recognition. Ethan trembled harder beneath that gaze. "I am sorry," he whispered weakly, though he did not even know what he was apologizing for anymore. Adrian looked at him carefully. "Why are you apologizing?" Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. "Because I caused trouble." The words came automatically. Years of hearing them had carved the sentence permanently into him. Something cold flickered across Adrian's face then. Not anger toward Ethan. Something else. The king stood slowly and turned toward his guards. "Prepare the royal sled." One of the older knights frowned in confusion. "Your Majesty? He is coming with us." Silence followed instantly. "Your Majesty," another guard said carefully, "we do not know who he is." Adrian looked back toward Ethan standing half-collapsed in the snow. "I know enough." The older knight lowered his voice. "Further. With respect, sir, he could be dangerous. The mark on his face is not a wound," Adrian interrupted quietly. The storm suddenly felt colder somehow. Every guard fell silent again. Adrian stepped toward Ethan once more and extended one gloved hand toward him. "Can you stand?" Ethan stared at the offered hand in disbelief. Nobody had reached for him like that in years. Not gently. Not without hesitation or disgust. His frozen fingers shook violently as he tried pushing himself upright. Pain shot through his legs immediately. Before Ethan could collapse again, Adrian caught him easily by the arm. Warmth spread instantly through the thick layers of Ethan's frozen cloak. Not ordinary warmth. Safe warmth. Steady. Ethan's breathing faltered painfully. The king's scent surrounded him faintly now beneath the snowstorm air. Cedarwood. Winter smoke. Cold mountains after rain. Strong enough to quiet the panic trembling through Ethan's chest. Adrian glanced down at him briefly. You are freezing. Ethan tried stepping away automatically. I am sorry. The king's brows tightened slightly at that repeated apology. Stop saying that. Ethan blinked softly in confusion. Adrian removed the heavy fur cloak draped over his own shoulders and wrapped it around Ethan without another word. The expensive black material swallowed Ethan completely, trapping surprising heat against his frozen body almost immediately. Gasps spread quietly among the royal guards watching nearby. Ethan looked horrified. Your Majesty, I cannot. You can. Adrian adjusted the cloak once before finally straightening again. Snowflakes melted slowly against the dark strands of his hair, while golden eyes remained fixed on Ethan with unnerving calm. What is your name? Ethan hesitated. Ethan Whitmore. The moment the name left his mouth, several guards visibly reacted. One cursed quietly under his breath. Another looked shocked. Whitmore? The older knight repeated. The noble family from the capital? Adrian's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. Interesting. Ethan lowered his eyes again, shame flooding through him automatically. I apologize if I caused trouble for the crown. Adrian stared at him for a long moment before finally speaking in a softer voice than before. Ethan. Ethan slowly looked up again. Nobody leaves a noble Omega to die in Frostmere during winter without reason. The king's gaze sharpened dangerously toward the distant south where the capital waited beyond mountains and snow. And I intend to find out exactly why your family was so desperate to get rid of you. The royal sled moved through the Frostmere forest long after sunset, cutting across frozen roads beneath a sky heavy with snow clouds. Ethan sat silently beneath layers of fur blankets while silver lanterns attached to the sled cast soft light across the endless white landscape around them. He still could not fully understand what had happened. Just hours ago, he had been kneeling alone in the snow waiting to disappear quietly beneath the storm. Now he sat inside the king's personal transport wrapped in royal furs worth more than everything he owned combined. None of it felt real. Across from him, King Adrian Blackwell remained silent for most of the journey. One gloved hand rested against the dark leather seat, while snow-covered forests reflected faintly in the carriage windows beside him. Even seated, the king's presence filled the entire space effortlessly. Calm. Controlled. Dangerous. Ethan kept his eyes lowered most of the time, afraid to accidentally offend him somehow. But every few minutes, he still felt Adrian watching him carefully. Not cruelly. Not mockingly. Just observantly. Like he was trying to solve a puzzle no one else had noticed existed. Ethan pulled the heavy fur cloak tighter around himself as another wave of exhaustion rolled through his body. His fingers still trembled faintly from the cold. The warmth beneath his scar had finally quieted after Adrian covered him with the royal cloak, though faint heat still lingered beneath his skin. One of the knights riding beside the sled finally spoke through the partially opened front curtain. Your Majesty, we will reach Blackthorne Fortress within 30 minutes. Adrian nodded once. Prepare the physicians. Ethan immediately looked up in alarm. Physicians? Adrian's golden eyes shifted toward him. You have severe frost exposure. I am fine. Ethan answered automatically. Adrian stared at him for one long second. No, you are not. Ethan lowered his eyes again, embarrassed by how weak he must look. I do not wish to inconvenience anyone. One of the older royal guards riding nearby let out a quiet breath through his nose. The boy apologizes more than he breathes. Ethan flushed immediately, shame burning through him. I am sorry. The knight looked like he regretted speaking at all. But before Ethan could shrink further into silence, Adrian spoke calmly from across the sled. No one here is asking for apologies. Ethan blinked softly. The king's voice was not gentle exactly. Adrian Blackwell did not seem like a gentle man. But there was something steady about him that unsettled Ethan far more than cruelty ever could. Kindness from strangers felt dangerous. Temporary. Unreal. The sled finally slowed as towering black gates appeared through the storm ahead. Blackthorne Fortress rose from the snowy cliffs like part of the mountain itself, enormous walls of dark stone illuminated by silver fire lanterns burning against the winter night. Ethan stared at the royal fortress in stunned silence. He had never seen anything so massive before. Guards lined the entrance walls while servants hurried across the snowy courtyard preparing for the king's arrival. The moment the sled stopped, several attendants rushed forward carrying lanterns and heavy cloaks. Adrian stepped out first without hesitation. Snow crunched beneath his boots as icy wind whipped across the fortress courtyard. Ethan hesitated before carefully climbing down after him. The second his feet touched the ground, dizziness hit him hard enough to nearly send him collapsing sideways. Adrian caught his arm instantly before he could fall. Ethan stiffened in shock at the sudden contact. "Careful," the king said quietly. Ethan's breathing stumbled slightly. Nobody had held him like that before. Not protectively. Not instinctively. One of the royal physicians hurried down the fortress steps carrying medical supplies before stopping abruptly at the sight of Ethan beside the king. Confusion flickered across the older Beta's face immediately. "Your Majesty?" Adrian released Ethan slowly but remained beside him. "Prepare a guest chamber near the eastern wing." The physician glanced uncertainly toward Ethan's scar partially visible beneath silver hair. "For him?" Adrian's gaze sharpened instantly. "Do you see another half-frozen Omega standing beside me?" The physician lowered his head immediately. "No, Your Majesty." Another nobleman standing near the fortress entrance quietly stepped closer, his expensive fur-lined coat marking him as one of the king's advisors. His eyes moved across Ethan critically before narrowing slightly. "Your Majesty," the advisor said carefully. "With respect, bringing an unknown Omega into Blackthorne during court season may create complications." Ethan instinctively stepped backward at once. There it was. The disgust. The regret. He should have expected it eventually. Adrian did not even look at the advisor. "Explain the complication." The nobleman hesitated. "His appearance alone could invite rumors." Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. "Of course. Ugly Omega. Disgrace. Embarrassment." Those words followed him everywhere. "Additionally," the advisor continued carefully, "if the court discovers the crown retrieved in abandoned Whitmore from Frostmere, certain noble families may question the wisdom behind enough." The single word cut cleanly through the courtyard. Silence fell instantly. Adrian finally turned toward the advisor fully now, golden eyes cold enough to freeze the storm itself. "This Omega was abandoned during a blizzard by one of the wealthiest noble families in the kingdom." His voice remained calm. "If anyone should be questioned, it is House Whitmore." The advisor immediately lowered his head. "Of course, Your Majesty." Adrian's expression remained unreadable another moment before he looked back toward Ethan again. Ethan stood completely still beneath the falling snow, overwhelmed and exhausted and deeply confused by everything happening around him. Why was the king defending him? Adrian studied him quietly before speaking again. "You are safe here." Ethan almost could not process the words. Safe. The concept itself felt foreign. Dangerous. Unreal. His throat tightened painfully before he quickly looked down again so nobody would see the sudden emotion in his eyes. "Thank you, Your Majesty," he whispered softly. Adrian watched him silently for a moment longer. Then his gaze shifted briefly toward the faint silver glow suddenly flickering beneath Ethan's hidden scar once again. Very faint. Almost invisible beneath the snowstorm lantern light. But Adrian saw it. And judging by the sudden stillness in his expression, the king was beginning to realize Ethan Whitmore was far more important than anyone in the kingdom yet understood. For the first time in years, Ethan woke somewhere warm. Soft morning light filtered through tall curtains beside the enormous bed while the crackling sound of firewood echoed quietly through the chamber. Ethan remained still beneath the blankets at first, confused by the unfamiliar softness surrounding him. The mattress beneath his body felt impossibly comfortable compared to the narrow servant bed he had slept on at the Whitmore estate. Even the air smelled different here. Cedarwood. Fresh linen. Winter tea drifting faintly from somewhere nearby. Slowly, memory returned. The snowstorm. The king. Blackthorne Fortress. Ethan sat upright too quickly and immediately winced as dizziness washed through him. Easy now. Ethan startled violently at the unfamiliar voice. An older beta physician stood beside the fireplace arranging glass medicine bottles across a silver tray. The man wore dark royal medical robes embroidered with the Blackthorne crest. You nearly collapsed from frost exposure last night, the physician said calmly. Do not try standing yet. Ethan immediately lowered his eyes. I apologize. The older man sighed softly beneath his breath, as though already exhausted by that word. His Majesty informed me you do that constantly. Ethan flushed faintly. The physician approached the bedside carrying a steaming cup of tea before stopping beside Ethan carefully. Drink this first. Ethan accepted the cup with hesitant hands. The warmth spread painfully through his frozen fingers almost immediately. He stared down at the tea uncertainly. Nobody outside. The servant kitchens had ever personally brought him anything before. Thank you, he whispered quietly. The physician studied him for a moment before speaking again. My name is Dr. Hale. Ethan nodded politely. Ethan Whitmore. Something unreadable flickered briefly across Dr. Hale's face at the name. Not disgust exactly. More like concern. How are you feeling? Ethan hesitated. Better than yesterday. Any pain? Ethan instinctively touched the side of his face beneath silver hair. Only here. Dr. Hale's expression sharpened slightly. The scar? Ethan lowered his hand immediately. Yes. The physician remained silent for several seconds before finally setting down his tray. May I examine it? Fear tightened instantly in Ethan's chest. Since childhood, servants and tutors had avoided looking directly at the scar whenever possible. Some whispered it was cursed. Others claimed it made him unsettling to look at for too long. Lady Margaret once called it proof that something was wrong with him from birth. Ethan swallowed nervously. It is unpleasant to see. Dr. Hale's expression softened slightly. I did not ask if it was pleasant. Ethan slowly brushed silver hair away from his cheek with trembling fingers. The pale scar curved beneath his left eye like fractured silver across porcelain skin. But this morning, faint light shimmered beneath it again. Dr. Hale froze instantly. Interesting, he murmured under his breath. Ethan's stomach tightened. What is it? The physician leaned closer carefully, studying the faint glow beneath the scar with growing confusion. This is not scar tissue. Ethan blinked softly. What? Dr. Hale looked genuinely unsettled now. Who told you this was a scar? Ethan stared at him in confusion. My family. The physician exchanged a brief glance toward the chamber doors before lowering his voice slightly. Ethan, this appears to be some form of seal. Silence filled the room instantly. Ethan felt cold despite the warmth surrounding him. Seal? Dr. Hale nodded slowly. Ancient sense suppression markings existed centuries ago among certain royal bloodlines. Ethan shook his head immediately. No. That is impossible. Perhaps. The physician continued examining the glowing mark carefully. But ordinary scars do not react to alpha proximity. Ethan's breathing slowed painfully. Alpha proximity? Dr. Hale looked at him carefully now. The glow intensified last night whenever His Majesty approached you. Ethan remembered the burning warmth beneath his skin each time Adrian touched him. The memory made his chest tighten strangely. I do not understand, he whispered. Before Dr. Hale could answer, a sharp knock interrupted them both. The chamber doors opened moments later and two royal attendants stepped inside carrying neatly folded clothing. Behind them came the cold winter scent Ethan recognized instantly now. King Adrian Blackwell entered the room wearing dark formal attire lined with silver embroidery, his expression unreadable as always. Ethan immediately tried rising from the bed despite Dr. Hale's warning. "Your Majesty." Adrian raised one hand slightly. "Stay seated." Ethan obeyed instantly. The attendants quietly placed clothing across a nearby chair before leaving the chamber again. Dr. Hale straightened respectfully. "Your Majesty." Adrian's golden eyes shifted briefly toward Ethan's exposed cheek where the glowing mark still flickered faintly beneath morning light. "You confirmed it?" Dr. Hale hesitated carefully. "I cannot explain it fully yet. But I no longer believe the mark is natural." Ethan looked between them both anxiously. "Please tell me what is happening." Adrian stepped closer toward the bed slowly. Unlike everyone else Ethan had known, the king never looked disturbed by the mark on his face. If anything, Adrian seemed more focused every time he saw it. "Your family told you the mark made you ugly," Adrian said calmly. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. "Yes. They lied." The words hit Ethan harder than expected. He looked up slowly in shock. Adrian's expression remained cold but steady. "That mark was placed on you intentionally." Ethan's heart began racing painfully. "Why?" Adrian's gaze darkened slightly. "That is what I intend to discover." Silence settled heavily between them. Ethan stared down at the blankets beneath, trembling fingers struggling to process everything. His entire life had been shaped around one belief: that something about him was wrong, broken, shameful. But now the king and royal physician stood here calmly discussing the possibility that the thing he hated most had never been a flaw at all. Fear mixed strangely with something even more dangerous inside Ethan's chest. Hope. Adrian studied him quietly before speaking again. "Until we understand this fully, you will remain under royal protection inside Blackthorne." Ethan looked up quickly. "Your Majesty, I do not wish to create problems for the crown." Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly at that familiar response. "Ethan." His voice lowered just enough to still the entire room. "You were abandoned in a snowstorm because your family feared something about you." The king stepped closer once more, golden eyes steady against Ethan's uncertain gaze. "And I have no intention of allowing anyone to harm you again." 3 days after Ethan arrived at Blackthorne Fortress, the entire royal court began whispering about him. Servants talked quietly in hallways whenever he passed. Knights exchanged uneasy looks near the eastern wing. Advisors suddenly stopped speaking whenever King Adrian entered a room. Ethan noticed all of it, even though everyone tried pretending otherwise. He spent most of those days inside the private eastern chambers assigned to him by the king, rarely leaving except when Dr. Hale insisted he walk through the fortress gardens for fresh air. The snowstorms outside had finally softened into steady winter snowfall, turning Blackthorne Fortress into something almost beautiful beneath silver skies. But Ethan still felt like a stranger wandering through someone else's life. Even the clothing provided for him felt unreal. Soft sweaters woven from expensive wool. Dark trousers tailored perfectly to his frame. Heavy winter coats lined with black fur bearing the royal crest stitched quietly near the collar. Nobody had ever cared whether Ethan was warm before. That fact unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. This morning, however, the fortress atmosphere felt different. Tense. Charged. Ethan noticed it immediately while standing beside the eastern garden windows watching snow drift slowly across the courtyard below. Guards moved faster than usual. Servants whispered urgently while carrying silver trays through the halls. Somewhere deeper inside the fortress, bells rang softly announcing the arrival of noble guests. Ethan turned as Dr. Hale entered the chamber carrying several folded garments across his arm. The physician's expression looked unusually serious. "His Majesty requests your presence in the Grand Hall tonight." Ethan blinked in confusion. "Mine? There will be a royal gathering." Dr. Hale hesitated briefly. "Several noble families arrived this morning." Unease tightened instantly in Ethan's chest. "Why would the king want me there?" Dr. Hale set the garments carefully across the bed. Because hiding you would only increase court speculation now. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the floor. I do not belong at royal gatherings. Neither did many people who eventually changed history. The physician replied quietly. Ethan looked uncomfortable immediately after hearing that. Please do not speak about me that way. Dr. Hale sighed softly. Ethan, whether you realize it or not, something important is happening around you. Ethan instinctively touched the mark beneath his silver hair. The strange seal had grown warmer each day since arriving at Blackthorne. Sometimes faint silver light escaped beneath his skin whenever Adrian stood too close. Dr. Hale still could not explain it completely. Neither could the royal scholars secretly summoned by the king 2 nights ago. All they knew was one terrifying truth. Ethan's mark was ancient. And hidden beneath it was an omega sense so powerful it had somehow been sealed away for years. A knock interrupted Ethan's thoughts before the chamber doors opened slowly. Ethan's breath caught slightly the moment Adrian entered the room. The king wore formal black attire embroidered with silver royal insignias, his dark coat draped sharply across broad shoulders. Snowflakes still clung faintly to his gloves from outside. Ethan immediately lowered his eyes. Your Majesty. Adrian's gaze settled briefly on the untouched formal clothing lying across the bed. You have not prepared. Ethan hesitated nervously. I was unsure if I should attend. Adrian stepped further into the room. You should. Ethan swallowed carefully. The court will not want me there. The court does not decide who stands beside the crown. Ethan's heartbeat stumbled faintly at those words. Adrian walked closer before stopping near the window overlooking the snowy fortress grounds. House Whitmore arrived this afternoon. Ethan froze completely. Cold spread instantly through his chest. My family? Adrian nodded once. Lady Margaret requested immediate audience with the crown after learning you survived Frostmere. Ethan stared at him in shock. Survived. The word itself confirmed everything Ethan had already feared. His family never expected him to return alive. Adrian's voice remained calm. They claimed your disappearance was a misunderstanding. Ethan looked away quickly toward the falling snow outside. A painful ache settled beneath his ribs. Somehow hearing it spoken aloud hurt more than abandonment itself. Caleb came too? He asked quietly. Adrian studied him carefully before answering. Yes. Silence filled the room for several long seconds. Ethan remembered Caleb standing nervously inside his bedroom before the exile. You should be careful tonight. Even now Ethan could not bring himself to hate his younger brother completely. That weakness frustrated him. Adrian's gaze softened almost imperceptibly while watching Ethan struggle silently with the news. You do not need to see them tonight if you are uncomfortable. Ethan immediately shook his head. No. Adrian raised one brow slightly. Ethan slowly straightened his posture despite the anxiety twisting through him. If my family truly came to explain themselves, then I should hear it. The king remained silent a moment before nodding once. Very well. Dr. Hale quietly approached the bed and unfolded the formal garments prepared for Ethan earlier. Soft silver fabric shimmered beneath the chamber firelight, elegant without being overly extravagant. Ethan stared at the clothing uncertainly. This is too expensive. Adrian looked almost annoyed by the statement. You are attending royal court, not cleaning servant halls. Ethan flushed faintly and lowered his eyes again. Dr. Hale cleared his throat softly while holding up the formal coat. There is one more thing. Ethan looked up cautiously. The physician hesitated before speaking carefully. The royal stylists requested permission to conceal your mark for tonight. Silence followed instantly. Ethan instinctively touched his cheek again. Conceal it. Hide it. The words felt painfully familiar. Adrian's expression darkened immediately before Ethan could even answer. No. Dr. Hale nodded once, unsurprised by the response. Ethan stared at the king quietly. Adrian stepped closer toward him again, golden eyes steady beneath the chamber light. You spent your entire life being treated as something shameful, he said calmly. That ends here. Ethan's chest tightened painfully at the certainty in Adrian's voice. Nobody had ever spoken about him that way before. Like he deserved dignity simply for existing. Outside the tall fortress windows, snow continued falling across Blackthorne, while somewhere deep below in the Grand Hall, Lady Margaret Whitmore waited nervously beneath royal chandeliers, completely unaware that the son she abandoned in a blizzard would soon walk into court wearing the king's protection instead of her shame. The Grand Hall of Blackthorne Fortress glittered beneath thousands of crystal lights, but the atmosphere inside felt colder than the snowstorm outside. Noble families filled the massive chamber dressed in silks, velvet, and jewels, while royal guards lined the marble walls beneath towering black banners bearing the crest of House Blackwell. Conversations flowed quietly through the hall, yet beneath every polite smile lingered the same restless curiosity. Everyone was waiting for the king. More importantly, everyone was waiting to see the mysterious Omega rescued from Frostmere. Near the center of the hall, Lady Margaret Whitmore stood stiffly beside Caleb beneath the enormous chandeliers. Her posture remained flawless as always, but tension showed clearly in the tightness of her gloved hands. Caleb looked pale beside her. Tonight. Unlike his mother, he seemed unable to fully hide his unease. "Mother," he whispered softly, "perhaps we should speak to Ethan privately before court begins." Lady Margaret's expression hardened instantly. "You will say nothing unless spoken to." Caleb lowered his eyes immediately. "Yes, mother." Around them, whispers quietly spread through the court. "They abandoned him during winter. The king personally brought him back. Why would His Majesty involve himself with a hidden Whitmore? Did you hear the mark on the Omega's face glows?" Lady Margaret ignored every whisper with practiced composure, though the faint color draining from her face betrayed her nerves. She had expected Ethan to disappear quietly beneath Frostmere's snow forever. Instead, the crown itself had returned him to court. Suddenly, the massive silver doors at the far end of the Grand Hall opened. The entire chamber fell silent instantly. King Adrian Blackwell entered first beneath the royal banners, his dark formal coat trailing behind him, while guards stepped aside immediately. Every noble bowed their heads at once. But tonight, Adrian did not walk alone. Ethan stepped into the hall beside the king. A wave of stunned silence swept across the chamber so completely that even the musicians stopped playing. Ethan nearly froze beneath the weight of hundreds of staring eyes. His silver formal attire shimmered softly beneath the chandeliers, while the black royal cloak draped over his shoulders marked him unmistakably as someone standing beneath the king's direct protection. But it was not the clothing that silenced the court. It was Ethan himself. His silver hair had been carefully brushed back tonight, fully exposing the mark beneath his left eye. And under the royal lights, the pale seals shimmered faintly like silver glass beneath his skin. Beautiful. Ethereal. Nothing like the ugly flaw House Whitmore had hidden for years. Lady Margaret's face drained completely of color. Caleb stared openly in shock beside her. Ethan felt his heartbeat racing painfully as whispers erupted across the chamber. "That is the hidden Whitmore? The mark is glowing. He does not look cursed at all. He looks royal." Ethan instinctively lowered his eyes, overwhelmed by the attention. But before anxiety could fully consume him, Adrian stepped slightly closer beside him. The subtle movement alone quieted half the room immediately. The king's presence felt like a wall at Ethan's side. Steady. Unshakable. Safe. Adrian guided Ethan toward the royal platform at the front of the hall, while nobles parted silently to make way for them. Every pair of eyes followed Ethan now, but for the first time in his life, nobody looked at him with disgust. Only shock. Confusion. Curiosity. They reached the royal dais moments later. Adrian turned slowly toward the gathered court, golden eyes calm and cold beneath the chandelier light. "Several days ago," the king began evenly, "I discovered an Omega abandoned during a blizzard in Frostmere territory." Uneasy silence spread instantly through the hall. Adrian's gaze shifted directly toward House Whitmore. That Omega was Ethan Whitmore. Lady Margaret immediately stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, there has been a terrible misunderstanding." Adrian looked at her without expression. "Explain it." Lady Margaret's voice remained graceful, but fear now flickered beneath it. My son has always suffered from delicate health. We intended to relocate him to a northern sanctuary for treatment. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. Even now, she lied so easily. Adrian remained silent for one long moment before finally speaking again. Interesting. His voice stayed dangerously calm. Because Ethan informed me your guards abandoned him alone in the forest during an active winter storm. Lady Margaret's composure cracked slightly. Your Majesty, Ethan has always been emotionally fragile. He may have misunderstood, Mother. The quiet interruption stunned the entire hall. Ethan had spoken. Lady Margaret slowly turned toward him in visible shock. Ethan's hands trembled faintly beneath the royal cloak, but he forced himself to continue. Please stop. Silence swallowed the chamber whole. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before lifting them again toward the woman who had spent his entire life teaching him he was unwanted. I tried very hard to become someone you could love, he said softly. But nothing was ever enough. Lady Margaret's expression tightened sharply. Ethan, this is not the place. You told me my face made me shameful. Ethan continued quietly. You said nobody should ever look at me. His voice shook slightly now despite his efforts to remain calm. I believed you. The court watched in complete silence. Even Caleb looked close to tears beside their mother now. Ethan touched the glowing seal beneath his eye slowly. But this was never ugliness, was it? Lady Margaret's face finally lost all remaining color. Adrian noticed immediately. So did Dr. Hale standing among the royal advisors nearby. The king's eyes narrowed dangerously. You knew. Lady Margaret said nothing. Adrian stepped forward slowly, his presence alone enough to make the surrounding nobles tense visibly. You recognized the seal. The grand hall felt breathless now. Ethan stared at his mother in growing confusion, while realization spread across the court like wildfire. Lady Margaret Whitmore had not hidden Ethan because he was ugly. She hid him because she knew exactly what he was. Adrian's voice lowered into something colder than the winter storm beyond Blackthorne walls. Tell the court. The king commanded quietly. Why House Whitmore feared this Omega enough to leave him buried in snow. Lady Margaret's lips trembled faintly before she finally whispered the truth barely loud enough for the silent hall to hear. Because the seal marks royal blood. Gasps spread instantly through the chamber. Ethan felt the world tilt beneath him. Royal blood. Impossible. Adrian looked toward Ethan slowly then, golden eyes steady as the silver mark beneath Ethan's cheek suddenly flared brighter than ever before beneath the royal chandeliers. And for the first time since his rescue from Frostmere, the king's expression softened ever so slightly while looking at him. Not pity. Not curiosity. Recognition.